So I guess we could say that at least Bitcoin would increase the cost of enforcement to some extent
Yes.
because it's just harder to enforce.
Yes.
Whatever your mechanism is, whether it's taxation or banning it as a medium of exchange, whatever it may be. And maybe another way, so if you say that increases the cost of enforcement, another way of saying that perhaps is that it's reducing the profitability of coercion, because the more tax revenues a government can extract with less enforcement points, the more profitable it would be. But if it becomes more expensive to enforce, holding tax revenue roughly equal, that it's a lower ROI basically for the tax
Yes.
authority. But I like that last point is really important. It's that you do need this mass or mainstream or public buy-in to an anti-Bitcoin narrative to really single it out, right, and tax it at 80 or 90% or whatever the special circumstances would be. So this, again, you're back to a narrative that has to be sold to the public, and then it would be the onus would be on, I guess, people like us, people that are just doing, talking, thinking through these things to kind of counter that imposed narrative. And hopefully, I guess, it's interesting because I don't feel like we're propagandizing Bitcoin when we talk about it, because it seems like, mostly truth. We're like, okay, this is money you can't print. Printing money and financial repression, all these things we're exploring here are inherently bad for the individual. So this is a better option for you. But I guess in some way we are propagandizing to the extent that you're helping create a counter narrative to whatever states would be creating to try and fight this thing. So how much of it is how much of the I guess the widespread success of Bitcoin do you think is driven by the battle at that narrative layer, the ideological layer?
It's hard to put a percent on it. I mean, obviously, if there was no technology, if the technology was not as good, then the narratives doesn't matter, right? So at the end of the day, technology is everything. But technology alone can still fail. I mean, if if it's hard enough to use, if not enough people get it, if they're distracted by altcoins and scams in the broader space, that can make it hard. And obviously, one of the attack vectors is energy, right? So especially during an energy crisis, that's been one of the kind of attack vectors to go after Bitcoin. And everyone has their own areas of research, right? So I never focus on the nuances of soft forks and what makes one algorithm better than another algorithm. That's not my area. But with my electrical engineering background, I do focus on the energy component to some extent, to make sure that there are people out there basically, I would say, doing the opposite, that they're using propaganda to overstate the problems of Bitcoin's energy or things like that. They're like, they'll say every Bitcoin transaction costs, like a whole year's worth of cars, fuel, or whatever the thing is, even though it doesn't actually map onto reality of how the network works. And so I do think it's important to push back on that, because even if just some percentage of people that read it are then like, wait a second, that's not what I was told by the media, or that's not what I was told by a government official. That's not I was told by other people. Maybe I should look more into this. Maybe this is more nuanced than I thought. And one thing I've been happy to see, for example, is Bitcoin initially, I mean, you had cypherpunks and you have libertarians and you have some conservatives. There is a wave of, say, progressive Bitcoiners. And I think it's important to nurture that, right? So some of them, there have been a number of them that say we're anti-Bitcoin because they thought honestly that it's an energy problem, that there must be a more efficient way to do this. But then due to educational efforts, they say, okay, wait, proof of work and proof of stake are not the same thing. The energy component is maybe not as problematic as I thought. Maybe it can even have some upsides in terms of being a flexible demand response. And then you get progressive Bitcoiners on board, and we actually see a decent number of them now. And so I think that those types of educate, especially when you have the truth on your side, if you're just laying out facts in the most persuasive and kind of compelling case you can, the clearest way you can, you're gonna get some percentage of intellectually honest people from multiple different backgrounds. And so I do think that while the technology, nothing matters if the technology is not there, the technology can still fail if it doesn't get some sort of critical mass to avoid some of the, the hardest, or even if it wins in the long run, it can take much longer to win because of that social layer, and individual users might not win, right? So even if the technology wins in a long arc of time, that doesn't mean that it wins with an individual user's lifetime, or they could be, in some way persecuted because of it. And so basically making it life easier for users of the network, and reducing, the frictions against the success of the network. I think that social layer is very important.
Yeah, it's a weird one for me because I know like towards the end of Human Action, Mises makes this point that all things being equal, a tool that's better than another tool, a shovel that digs holes faster or whatever, will tend to just outcompete in the marketplace, right? People will just favor the tool. Again, cost, everything else being equal, they'll choose the tool that most enhances productivity towards whatever activity the tool is designed for. But he goes on to make this other point that that's not necessarily the case with our modes of social organization, right? That you can organize a lot of people under communism for a really long time, and they won't really understand that capitalism is a superior mode of allocating resources until communism like blows up, basically. So it's not the same. And I don't know, Bitcoin's a weird one because it's like, where does it fall? It is just a technology. It's better money in a lot of respects, but it also has this ideological component, that you see it expressed in multiple ways. People are diehard religious zealots for Bitcoin, or they're total Bitcoin derangement syndrome, as we call it. They just think it's the most evil thing ever. So I don't know how to understand the success of Bitcoin. Like you said, it's hard to quantify between I guess the technological layer and the social layer. I don't even know where you draw the line necessarily, because with money, money is such an inherently a social construct. Anyways, I'm just thinking out loud, but it's a interesting one to try and parse.
Yeah, it's a good set of questions. I don't think there is any firm line. One way I'd phrase it is that let's say you're comparing two technologies. Obviously, the gap in terms of how much better one technology is than another increases the odds that it succeeds against friction. Like let's say there's a shovel that's, 10% better than another shovel, but the slightly worse shovel is like government approved, right? That
Right.
shovel might win because it's not a gigantic difference at the end of the day. Um, whereas if one shovel is like 10 times better, people are going to eventually figure it out and ignore the social consensus. But like, look, it's so obviously better.
Mhm.
And so I think that's why with Bitcoin, it's part, again, whatever kind of talents or knowledge people have. I mean, if they're, if they're good at programming, one way they can do it is by making it better, right? So the better Bitcoin is for the user, the easier it
Mhm.
is to use, the faster it is, right? So Lightning Network, the more liquid it is, the better it is to use, the more convenient, the less chance they have of like losing their keys because it's just it's unclear how to use it properly. The better that technology is, the harder it is to ignore in the long run. Whereas the clunkier it is to use, the less perfect it is. There's just more frictions where someone could use something else or just not bother. And so I think that really comes down to the whole ecosystem. Everyone has a part to play in shaping reality. That's not just a Bitcoin thing. That's just they all have a part to play. And as it pertains to Bitcoin, programmers and developers have a part to play. VCs have a part to play because they're funding those types of projects that, might not be super profitable, might be good for the Bitcoin network. And then just writers or influencers or whatever you want to call them. I mean, their usefulness can be their writing or their speaking ability to then take some of the subjects that those technical people are doing and try to explain the truth to that to the public, right? So I think that different people have kind of a role to play, and it's the combination of just how much how good the technology is. Number one, not just the base layer, but the whole ecosystem of how to interact with it. And then number two, that whole social layer. And there is, like you said, there's not really a hard line there.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. So it has a lot to do with the relative superiority of Bitcoin to alternative monies, let's say, or assets. And that delta does seem to be growing not only as Bitcoin related technology improves, right? It becomes easier to custody and store and transact. And you're abstracting away a lot of the complexity. And we've seen that happen with Bitcoin. Using Bitcoin in 2014 was a whole different ball game than what it is today. It's much more accessible, let's say, to the mainstream market participant. But I like that point a lot, because I would say on the other side of that is, with every dollar printed, you're also diverging that utility further, right? That the dollar it's self-destructing basically in slow motion, right? Or whatever fiat currency you want to compare that to.
Yes.
And in relationship with the perfect supply integrity of Bitcoin, that would mean the ratio of Bitcoin's utility to that fiat is growing as well. So it's got this, I guess, it's being attacked from two sides. And then, of course, the counterforce to all that is what we're talking about: the government, regulation or banning things like that.
Yeah. And I think it also matters with Bitcoin versus altcoins, right? Because one of the big challenges with gold for decades is that people could make paper claims on gold because it's pretty centralized and it's hard to take custody of. And then more, people could think they own gold when really they own paper gold. And it's kind of like musical chairs where, if really kind of push came to shove, not every single holder of those paper claims would be able to get their hands on physical metal. And I think the Bitcoin equivalent of that, so Bitcoin, because it's more portable, kind of solves for that. The paper market for Bitcoin is much smaller than the Bitcoin market cap, at least currently so far. But I think the kind of all, the similar version is that anyone can make up an altcoin, and you can then divert capital that would otherwise go into Bitcoin into a whole bunch of other projects. And some of them have pretty big VC backing and can last for years, and maybe some of them will last for a decade, right? And so all of that can potentially slow down Bitcoin adoption, obfuscate Bitcoin adoption, and represent at least, if not a long-term threat, at least like a timing threat. And then you get into, kind of uh, political buy-ins, right? So if you're a proof of stake network, you have now an incentive to be like to get policymakers to go after proof of work. They look how energy inefficient that is. Our network's proof of stake, it's it's ESG certified, whatever the case may be. Go after proof of work, and then even among Bitcoin, the alternative view is that Bitcoin does not pass the Howey test. So in the United States, there's almost no way that it could be considered a security, whereas many other altcoins they would be considered securities. And so some Bitcoiners face a challenge where if they're like anarchists, maybe they're like, well, who cares what a security is? Or they say, well, let's use that weakness against our altcoin opponents and be like, well, you should crack down on securities because it hurts almost anything other than Bitcoin and maybe a few other forks and little tokens. But the vast majority of the space then is harmed by regulations that go after unregistered securities. And so there is that kind of that's where the social layer comes in, right? Because different sides and different factions in each sides are kind of picking battles about how they want to attack the other network. And so it's Bitcoin versus altcoins, it's altcoin versus altcoins, it's Bitcoin versus governments, it's Bitcoin versus gold. There's multiple things. There's like a multi-part battle that goes on, and that's kind of part of the market testing. How much power does this thing have? How much better is it than all of its competitors? How much better is it than everything else? Because if the technology is way better, and if the social layer is there, it can get past that friction.